In a world where desperation makes people say things they never imagined, where a mother's love knows no boundaries, and where honor can cost everything, one conversation would reshape three lives forever. When Maria Santos stood in that dimly lit hospital corridor, her hands trembling as she clutched the adoption papers, she never expected the words that would come out of her mouth. She never expected the response that would follow. And she certainly never expected that a simple promise to protect her son would lead to a love story that defied every odd, challenged every assumption, and proved that sometimes the most beautiful relationships are born from the most desperate moments. This isn't just another love story. This isn't just another tale of sacrifice. This is the raw, unfiltered account of what happens when two broken souls find each other in the darkest hour, when duty becomes devotion, and when protecting someone becomes the greatest act of love. Get ready to witness a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and the lengths people will go to for family. The fluorescent lights in St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with an annoying persistence that matched the anxiety coursing through Maria Santos's veins. She sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair outside the pediatric intensive care unit, her 5-year-old son Miguel fighting for his life behind those heavy doors. The doctors had delivered the devastating news 3 hours ago. Miguel needed an immediate heart transplant, and even then, his chances were slim. The medical bills were already astronomical, and Maria knew her minimum wage job at the local diner wouldn't cover even a fraction of what was needed. Her fingers traced the edges of the adoption papers she'd been carrying for weeks. The wealthy Hartwell family wanted to adopt Miguel, promising him the best medical care money could buy. All she had to do was sign, and her son would live. But he wouldn't be hers anymore. The thought made her stomach churn with a pain deeper than any physical wound she'd ever experienced. That's when she saw him. James Mitchell, the private security consultant the Hartwells had hired to handle the delicate transition of the adoption. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled out his navy suit jacket perfectly. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his green eyes held an intensity that made her feel like he could see straight through to her soul. But it wasn't his physical appearance that caught her attention. It was the way he carried himself. There was something both protective and gentle about his presence, a combination that reminded her of her late father. James had been watching Maria for the past 2 weeks, not in a creepy way, but as part of his job to assess the situation and ensure the adoption process went smoothly. What he hadn't expected was to be so affected by this young mother's obvious devotion to her son. Every day, she sat in that same chair, sometimes for 12 hours straight, refusing to leave Miguel's side except when absolutely necessary. She brought books to read to him, even when he was unconscious. She sang lullabies that made the hardened nurses tear up, and she never, not once, showed anything but love and hope, even when the doctors delivered increasingly grim updates. The Hartwell family was everything Maria wasn't. Robert Hartwell owned 3 successful tech companies, and his wife Catherine was a prominent socialite who collected children like some people collected art. They already had 4 adopted children, all showcased on their Christmas cards and social media posts like perfect little trophies. They wanted Miguel because he would complete their diverse family portfolio, as Catherine had coldly put it during one of their meetings. The irony wasn't lost on James that people with so much money could have so little heart. As James approached Maria that evening, he noticed her hands shaking as she stared at the adoption papers. She looked up at him with eyes red from crying, and he saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten. It was the look of a woman about to sacrifice everything she loved for the chance to save it. Mrs. Santos, he said softly, settling into the chair beside her. How are you holding up? Maria let out a bitter laugh that held no humor. How do you think? I'm about to give away my son to people who see him as a charity case. They'll give him a better life than I ever could, but they'll never love him the way I do. Her voice cracked on the last words. James had handled dozens of adoption cases, but none had affected him like this one. Usually, he maintained professional distance, did his job, and moved on. But something about Maria's fierce love for her son, her willingness to break her own heart to save his life, made him question everything about this particular arrangement. The Hartwells are good people, he found himself saying, though the words felt hollow even to him. Are they? Maria turned to face him fully, and James felt the full force of her intelligence and determination. Mrs. Hartwell asked me yesterday if Miguel had any behavioral issues that might affect their other children. She wanted to know if his medical condition might be too much of an emotional burden on their family. Those were her exact words. Does that sound like someone who's going to love my son? James didn't answer because he couldn't. He'd witnessed that conversation, and it had made him uncomfortable too. Catherine Hartwell had approached the adoption with the same detached efficiency she used when redecorating her houses. I need to ask you something, Maria said suddenly, her voice taking on a desperate edge that made James's protective instincts flare. And I need you to answer honestly. Okay, do you think they'll really take care of him? Not just medically, but emotionally? Will they hold him when he has nightmares about the hospital? Will they remember that he likes his sandwiches cut in triangles and that he's afraid of thunderstorms? Will they love him like he deserves to be loved? The questions hit James like physical blows. He thought about the Hartwell children he'd met, all of whom seemed well cared for, but emotionally distant from their adoptive parents. They had everything money could buy, but lacked the warmth and genuine affection he saw between Maria and Miguel every single day. I don't know, he admitted, and saw something in Maria's face crumble. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. Finally, Maria spoke again, her voice so quiet James had to lean closer to hear her. What if there was another way? What do you mean? Maria turned to face him completely, and James saw a wildness in her eyes that both intrigued and worried him. What if someone else adopted him? Someone who would let me be part of his life. Someone who could afford his medical care, but wouldn't treat him like a possession. Mrs. Santos, I don't think you understand how adoption works. The Hartwells have already been approved. They've paid the fees, and they have the resources to what about you? The words hung in the air between them like a live wire. James felt his mouth go dry as he processed what she was suggesting. Me? Mrs. Santos, I think you're under a lot of stress, and you're not thinking clearly. I can't just, why not? Maria's voice gained strength as the idea took hold in her mind. You're successful, right? You own your own security firm. You could afford Miguel's medical care. And I can see the way you look at him when you think no one's watching. You care about him. James opened his mouth to protest, but Maria continued, her words coming faster now as desperation fueled her pitch. I know this sounds crazy, but hear me out. You adopt Miguel, and I'll do whatever you need. I'll work for you. I'll clean your house. I'll cook your meals. I'll be whatever you need me to be. Just please don't let them take him away from me completely. The raw pain in her voice made James's chest ache. He thought about his own life. A successful business, a beautiful house that felt empty most of the time, and a string of relationships that had failed because he'd never been able to fully open his heart to anyone. The idea of suddenly becoming responsible for a sick child and his devoted mother should have terrified him. Instead, He found himself actually considering it. Maria, he said carefully, using her first name for the first time, what you're suggesting is complicated. There would be legal issues, financial considerations, and I'm not even sure if it's possible to transfer the adoption at this point. But you're not saying no, Maria observed, hope creeping into her voice for the first time in weeks. James looked at her closely, taking in her determined expression, the way she unconsciously leaned toward him as if her whole future hung on his next words. And maybe it did. He thought about Miguel, who despite his illness always smiled when James visited and had once asked if James was going to be his new daddy. The question had caught James off guard, but now he wondered if maybe that innocent child had seen something the adults had missed. If I were to consider this, James said slowly, and I'm not saying I am, but if I were, what exactly are you proposing? Maria's eyes lit up with the first real hope he'd seen from her. I'll sign whatever papers you need. I'll work for you however you want. I'll be your housekeeper, your cook, your assistant, whatever you need. In exchange, you adopt Miguel, and let me be part of his life. You get the legal rights to make medical decisions and provide for him, but I get to still be his mother in every way that matters. And what about us? James found himself asking, what kind of arrangement are you talking about exactly? Maria's cheeks flushed slightly, but her voice remained steady. Whatever kind you want. I just need my son to be safe and loved. If that means I have to, if you need me to be more than just a housekeeper, then that's what I'll do. The implication hung heavy between them, and James felt something shift in his chest. Not because of what she was offering, but because of why she was offering it. This woman was willing to sacrifice everything, even herself, for her child's well-being. It was both heartbreaking and incredibly attractive. Maria, you don't have to offer that, he said gently. If I were to do this, it would be because I want to help Miguel, not because I want something from you in return. But I want to give you something, Maria insisted. I need to feel like I'm earning this somehow. I can't just take charity. I need to know I'm contributing, that I'm valuable to you in some way. Otherwise, what's to stop you from changing your mind and sending me away later? James understood her fear, but her words also revealed something else. She didn't just see this as a business arrangement. She was offering herself completely and utterly to save her son. The magnitude of that sacrifice was staggering. Let me ask you something, James said. If I agree to this, if I somehow make it work legally and financially, what happens when Miguel is better? What happens when he doesn't need constant medical care anymore? Do you still want to be stuck in some arrangement with a stranger? Maria was quiet for a long moment, considering his question. When she finally answered, her voice was soft but certain. You're not a stranger. I've watched you for 2 weeks, and I see who you are. You're kind to the nurses even when they're stressed and snappy. You always ask about Miguel's comfort, not just his medical condition. You brought that stuffed elephant for him even though no one asked you to, and you stayed to read to him when I had to step out to handle insurance paperwork. You're not a stranger, James. You're the kind of man I'd want in my son's life regardless of the circumstances. Her words hit James harder than any professional compliment ever had. She saw him, really saw him, in a way that no one else ever had. And suddenly, the idea of having this brave, devoted woman and her resilient son in his life didn't seem like an obligation or a burden. It seemed like the missing piece he'd been searching for without even realizing it. The Hartwells won't give up easily, he warned. They've invested a lot of money in this adoption, and they don't like to lose. But you could make it happen. Maria pressed. You could find a way. James thought about his connections, his resources, the favors he could call in. It would be complicated and expensive, but it wasn't impossible. The question was whether he was brave enough to completely upend his carefully ordered life for a woman he'd known for 2 weeks and a child who wasn't his. But as he looked at Maria's hopeful face and thought about Miguel's trusting smile, James realized he'd already made his decision. Maybe it was crazy, maybe it was the worst idea he'd ever had, but for the first time in his adult life, he was going to follow his heart instead of his head. "I'll need to make some calls," he said finally, and watched Maria's face transform with pure joy and relief. "You'll really do it? You'll really help us?" "I'll do everything I can," James promised, and meant it. Maria reached out without thinking and grabbed his hand, squeezing it tightly. The contact sent a jolt through James's entire system, and he realized that this arrangement was going to be much more complicated than either of them had anticipated. But looking at their joined hands and thinking about the little boy fighting for his life just beyond those doors, James knew he'd never made a more important decision in his life. The fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead, but somehow the hospital corridor felt less cold and hopeless than it had an hour before. Two strangers had just agreed to bind their lives together in the most unconventional way possible, all for the love of a little boy who needed them both. And though neither James nor Maria could have predicted it at that moment, they had just taken the first step towards something that would change all three of their lives in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. The next morning brought chaos that James hadn't fully anticipated. His phone started ringing at 5:30 a.m. with a call from Robert Hartwell's personal attorney, demanding an immediate meeting. By 7 a.m., James found himself sitting in the conference room of Hartwell and Associates, facing not just Robert and Catherine Hartwell, but also their team of 3 lawyers, a private investigator, and what appeared to be a crisis management specialist. Catherine Hartwell was everything Maria wasn't. Perfectly polished, coldly beautiful, and radiating the kind of entitled anger that came from always getting what she wanted. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her designer suit probably cost more than Maria made in 6 months. When she spoke, her voice was clipped and precise, like she was addressing particularly dim servants. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, not bothering with pleasantries, "we understand you've developed some sort of attachment to the Santos woman and her child. While we appreciate your humanitarian instincts, we need to remind you that you work for us. We have a contract, both with you and for the adoption of Miguel Santos." James had spent the entire night making phone calls, researching legal precedents, and consulting with his own attorney. He'd learned more about family law in 8 hours than he'd ever wanted to know, but he'd also discovered that the situation wasn't as hopeless as it had initially seemed. "Mrs. Hartwell," James replied calmly, "I need to clarify something. My contract with you was to facilitate the adoption process and ensure its smooth completion. There was never any clause that prevented me from pursuing legal adoption myself, nor was there any exclusivity agreement regarding the child." Robert Hartwell, a thin man with gray hair and calculating eyes, leaned forward. "Don't play word games with us, Mitchell. We've invested significant resources in this adoption. The home studies, the legal fees, the medical consultations. We're talking about over $100,000, which you'll be refunded," James said. "I'm prepared to reimburse you for all documented expenses related to the adoption process." The room fell silent, except for the scratching of one lawyer's pen as he scribbled notes. Catherine's face had turned an interesting shade of red, and James could practically see her mentally calculating how to destroy him professionally and personally for this betrayal. "This is about money, isn't it?" she said finally. "That little Mexican woman offered you something, didn't she? What was it? Sex? A cut of some insurance settlement? There's always an angle with people like her. The casual racism and cruelty in her words made James's jaw clench, but he kept his voice level. Mrs. Hartwell, I'd advise you to be very careful about what accusations you make, especially regarding a woman who's shown more grace and dignity in the past few weeks than I've seen from anyone in this room. How dare you? Catherine started, but her husband placed a restraining hand on her arm. Let's keep this professional, Roberts said, though his eyes were cold as winter. Mr. Mitchell, you're making a serious mistake. We have resources you can't imagine. We can make your life and the life of that woman and her child very difficult. We can challenge any adoption attempt you make, tie you up in court for years, and ensure that by the time it's all over, the boy will either be dead or too damaged to save. The threat hung in the air like poison, and James felt his protective instincts surge. These people saw Miguel not as a child in need, but as a possession they were entitled to own. The idea of that little boy growing up in their cold, manipulative environment made him feel physically sick. Are you threatening the well-being of a sick child? James asked quietly, making sure his tone conveyed exactly how dangerous that ground was. Robert backtracked slightly. Of course not. We're simply pointing out the legal realities. Adoption is a complex process, and any challenges or delays could be unfortunate for everyone involved. James stood up, having heard enough. Gentlemen, ladies, I think we're done here. You'll receive notice from my attorney within 48 hours regarding the formal reimbursement of your expenses and the termination of our professional relationship. I'd suggest you start looking for another child to adopt, because Miguel Santos is no longer available. As he moved toward the door, Catherine's voice stopped him. You're a fool if you think this is over. We know people, Mitchell, judges, social workers, hospital administrators. We can make sure that woman never sees her son again, with or without your help. James turned back slowly, and something in his expression made even Catherine take a step back. In his line of work, James had dealt with some genuinely dangerous people, and he'd learned how to project a very specific kind of menace when necessary. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable edge, let me be very clear about something. If you or anyone associated with you takes any action that harms Maria Santos or her son, you'll discover that my security firm has capabilities beyond just facilitation adoption processes. I have connections too, and mine are considerably less civilized than yours. Do we understand each other? The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Robert cleared his throat. I think there's been enough posturing on all sides. We'll expect our reimbursement promptly, and then we'll consider this matter closed. But James could see in Catherine's eyes that she had no intention of letting this go. People like her didn't lose gracefully, and they certainly didn't let perceived slights go unpunished. As he left the building, James was already mentally preparing for the war he knew was coming. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Maria was experiencing her own crisis. She'd arrived that morning to find a new social worker waiting in Miguel's room, along with someone who introduced herself as a representative from Child Protective Services. The previous social worker, Mrs. Patterson, who had been kind and supportive, was nowhere to be found. Ms. Santos, the new social worker, a stern woman named Mrs. Reeves, said without preamble, "We've received some concerning information about your recent behavior and decision-making regarding your son's care and future." Maria's blood ran cold. "What kind of information?" "We understand you've been making private arrangements regarding Miguel's adoption without going through proper channels. There are also questions about your mental state and your ability to make rational decisions during this difficult time." The CPS representative, a tired-looking man in his 50s consulted his tablet. MS. Santos, have you recently promised to enter into a personal services arrangement with a man named James Mitchell in exchange for his adopting your son? The way he phrased it made the situation sound sordid and desperate, which Maria supposed it was from a certain perspective. But she lifted her chin and met his gaze steadily. I've explored legal options for ensuring my son receives the best possible care while maintaining our relationship, she said carefully. Everything I've considered has been within the bounds of the law. Have you offered sexual services in exchange for this arrangement? Mrs. Reeves asked bluntly. Maria felt her cheeks burn, but she held her ground. I offer to work as household staff in exchange for being allowed to remain part of my son's life. If you want to twist it into something ugly, that's on you, not me. What Maria didn't know was that Catherine Hartwell had spent the morning on the phone, using her extensive network of social connections to paint Maria as an unstable woman making inappropriate arrangements to avoid losing her son. It was a calculated move designed to make James's adoption attempt impossible while simultaneously destroying Maria's credibility as a parent. The questioning continued for over an hour, with both social workers probing every aspect of Maria's life, her relationship with James, and her mental state. They asked about her finances, her living situation, her family support system, and her plans for Miguel's future. Each question felt like an attack, and Maria could feel her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. That's when James arrived. He'd come straight from his meeting with the Hartwells, expecting to update Maria on his progress with the legal proceedings. Instead, he walked into what looked like an interrogation. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic in the room, and Maria felt some of her tension ease. I'm sorry, he said politely to the social workers, but who are you? And why are you questioning Ms. Santos without her attorney present? Mrs. Reeves drew herself up importantly. I'm the social worker assigned to this case, and this is Mr. Davidson from Child Protective Services. We're conducting a routine evaluation of the family situation. Routine. James's voice was skeptical. Ms. Santos has been dealing with the same social worker for weeks, and now suddenly, there's a new team asking invasive questions about her personal life. That doesn't sound routine to me. Mr. Davidson consulted his tablet again. Mr. Mitchell, I presume? We actually have some questions for you as well. Can you explain the nature of your relationship with Ms. Santos and the circumstances surrounding your sudden interest in adopting her son? James moved to stand beside Maria's chair, close enough that she could feel his presence like a shield. My relationship with Ms. Santos began professionally as I was handling security aspects of the previous adoption arrangement. Over time, I've come to care about both her and Miguel's well-being. When the previous arrangement fell through, I offered to help by pursuing adoption myself. And what do you expect to receive in return for this generous offer? Mrs. Reeves asked, her tone making it clear she expected the worst. I expect to give a little boy who needs medical care and a loving home the chance to have both, James replied evenly. I expect to do what's right for a child whose mother loves him more than her own life. Maria felt tears sting her eyes at his words, but she blinked them back. She couldn't afford to appear emotional or unstable right now. The questioning might have continued, but they were interrupted by Dr. Rodriguez, Miguel's primary physician. The elderly doctor looked harried and frustrated as he entered the room. What's going on here? He asked, taking in the crowd of adults surrounding Miguel's bed where the little boy was sleeping peacefully. This is a medical facility, not a courthouse. Mrs. Reeves started to explain their presence, but Dr. Rodriguez cut her off with a wave of his hand. I don't care about your bureaucratic procedures. I care about my patient who needs rest and stability, not a circus in his room. Everyone who isn't medical staff or immediate family needs to leave. Now, Doctor, we have a legal obligation to, Mr. Davidson began. You have an obligation to not interfere with medical care, Dr. Rodriguez said firmly. Miguel Santos is a critically ill child who has shown remarkable improvement in the past few weeks, largely due to the stable, loving environment his mother has provided. If you want to continue this discussion, it can happen in a conference room, not in my patient's room. As the social workers reluctantly agreed to move their investigation elsewhere, Dr. Rodriguez caught James's eye and nodded toward the door. James understood the signal and followed the doctor out into the hallway, leaving Maria to gather herself and check on Miguel. Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Rodriguez said quietly, I don't know what's going on with the adoption situation, but I need you to know that this child's medical condition is improving faster than anyone expected. The new heart they found for him is a perfect match, and we're scheduling surgery for next week. James felt relief wash over him. That's wonderful news. It is, but it also means that whatever legal issues you're facing need to be resolved quickly. Miguel is going to need a stable home environment for his recovery, and he's going to need his mother. That woman has been his constant companion through this entire ordeal. Separating them now could seriously impact his recovery. The doctor's words gave James the ammunition he needed. As he walked back into Miguel's room, he was already mentally preparing his next moves. He would call his attorney immediately and file emergency adoption papers. He would use his connections to ensure the process moved quickly, and he would make sure that Maria and Miguel were protected from whatever additional attacks the Hartwells and their allies might launch. But first, he needed to talk to Maria. As the social workers finally left, promising to return the next day with additional questions, James pulled a chair up next to Maria's and took her hand. How are you holding up? He asked softly. Maria managed a shaky smile. I've been better. They made everything sound so dirty, like I was selling myself or making some kind of sordid deal. You were making the ultimate sacrifice for your son, James said firmly. Anyone who can't see the difference between that and what they were implying isn't worth listening to. But what if they're right? What if I'm being selfish by trying to stay in Miguel's life? What if I'm putting my own needs ahead of what's best for him? James squeezed her hand. Maria, look at me. Your son is getting better because he knows you love him. The doctors can provide medical care, but they can't provide the kind of love and security that helps a child fight for his life. You've given him reasons to keep fighting every single day. But now I've dragged you into this mess, Maria said, guilt evident in her voice. You're going to lose clients, make enemies, all because you tried to help us. James was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. Can I tell you something? I've spent the last 10 years building a successful business, accumulating wealth, and maintaining professional relationships. But until I met you and Miguel, I never really felt like my life had purpose. Everything I've accomplished feels meaningless compared to the chance to give that little boy a future and to give you peace of mind. Maria studied his face, searching for any sign that he was just being kind or feeling obligated. What she saw instead was sincerity and something else that made her heart skip a beat. It looked almost like love, though she was afraid to believe it. James, she said quietly, what happens after Miguel gets better? What happens to us? It was the question James had been asking himself all morning. What had started as a rescue mission was becoming something much more complicated. Somewhere between watching Maria's devotion to her son and feeling her trust in him, James had begun to care about her in a way that had nothing to do with obligation or pity. I don't know, he admitted, but I'd like the chance to find out if you're willing. Before Maria could respond, a small voice from the bed interrupted them. Mama, is James going to be my new daddy? Miguel was awake, his dark eyes bright with curiosity and hope. Both adults turned toward him, and James felt his heart clench at the trust he saw on the child's face. Would you like that, little man? James asked, surprising himself with how much he wanted the answer to be yes. Miguel nodded enthusiastically. James brings good snacks, and he reads the voices different for all the characters. Plus, Mama smiles more when he's here. Out of the mouths of babes, James and Maria exchanged a look over Miguel's head, and both of them realized that this arrangement was going to be anything but simple. But looking at Miguel's hopeful face and feeling the connection growing between them, James knew he was ready for whatever complications lay ahead. The war with the Heartwells was just beginning, but James was no longer fighting just for duty or obligation. He was fighting for his family, even if he was still figuring out exactly what that meant. The heart surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late November, and the week leading up to it was the longest of James's life. He'd successfully filed emergency adoption papers and obtained temporary guardianship, but the legal battle with the Heartwells was far from over. Their lawyers had challenged every document, questioned every procedure, and filed motion after motion designed to delay and complicate the process. James was spending more on legal fees than most people made in a year, but every time he looked at Miguel's trusting face or saw Maria's grateful smile, he knew it was worth every penny. The night before the surgery, James found himself in an unexpected position. He was staying at Maria's tiny studio apartment for the first time. It wasn't romantic or planned. Miguel had been discharged from the hospital for a few days before the surgery, and Maria was too nervous to stay alone. She'd asked James, almost shyly, if he could spend the night on her couch, just in case something happened. What she really meant was that she was terrified and needed someone strong and reliable nearby, and James was honored that she trusted him enough to ask. Maria's apartment was nothing like James's spacious house in the suburbs. The entire place would have fit in his living room, and the furniture was a mismatched collection of secondhand pieces held together with determination and love. But it was clean and warm, and every surface was covered with Miguel's artwork, photos of him and Maria, and small touches that spoke of a life lived with intention despite limited resources. The refrigerator was covered with Miguel's drawings, many of which now featured a tall man with dark hair labeled James, alongside the traditional stick figures of Mama and me. That evening, as Maria bustled around making dinner in her tiny kitchen, James sat on the floor with Miguel, helping him build an elaborate castle out of blocks. The little boy's energy was remarkable considering his condition, though James could see the subtle signs of his illness. The slight blue tinge to his lips when he got excited, the way he tired quickly and needed frequent rests, the careful way Maria monitored his breathing and color constantly. James, Miguel said seriously as he placed a block tower on top of their castle, when you become my daddy, will you still read me stories? The question hit James harder than he'd expected. Over the past few weeks, he'd fallen into the habit of reading to Miguel every evening, doing different voices for the characters and making the little boy giggle with his dramatic interpretations. It had become one of James's favorite parts of each day. Of course I will, James promised. Every night if you want. What about when I'm all better? Will you still want to read to me when I can run around and play soccer and stuff? James felt his throat tighten. The idea of Miguel healthy and active, playing sports and living a normal childhood was everything they were all fighting for. Especially then, he said, I want to read to you and teach you to ride a bike and help you with homework and come to all your soccer games. Miguel beamed, and Mama will still be Mama? Always, James said firmly. No one could ever replace your Mama. She'll always be your Mama, and I'll just be a bonus dad. From the kitchen came the sound of a sniffle, and James realized Maria was listening to their conversation. When he looked over, she was wiping her eyes with a dish towel and smiling at them with such warmth that it made his chest ache. Later that evening, after Miguel had been tucked into a small bed with his favorite stuffed elephant, the one James had brought him, James and Maria sat together on her tiny couch, sharing a cup of tea and the strange intimacy of two people about to become a family in the most unconventional way possible. Are you scared about tomorrow? James asked softly. Maria nodded, not trusting her voice. The surgery was risky, and even with the best possible outcome, Miguel would face a long recovery and a lifetime of medications and medical monitoring. There were no guarantees, and the possibility of losing him was still very real. I keep thinking about all the things I want to tell him in case. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. James reached over and took her hand, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. Tell me instead, if something happens tomorrow, what would you want Miguel to know? Maria was quiet for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft and dreamy, as if she were talking to Miguel himself. I want him to know that every day with him has been the best day of my life. That even when he was sick, even when I was scared, he made everything brighter just by being himself. I want him to know that he's funny and smart and kind, and that he has the biggest heart of anyone I've ever met. And I'd want him to know that meeting James was like having our prayers answered, because now Miguel will have someone who loves him almost as much as I do. Her words made James's heart race. She'd said he loved Miguel, not that he cared about him or was fond of him, but that he loved him. And the scary thing was she was right. Somewhere between reading bedtime stories and building block castles and watching Miguel fight for his life with incredible courage, James had fallen completely in love with this brave little boy. Maria, he said carefully, what you said about Miguel having someone who loves him almost as much as you do, what about having someone who loves you too? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them had dared to voice before. They'd been so focused on Miguel and the adoption and the legal battles that they hadn't really discussed what was happening between the two of them. James, Maria whispered, we agreed this was about Miguel. I don't want you to feel obligated to. I mean, I know I said I'd be whatever you needed, but I don't want you to think you have to. Maria? James's voice was firm, but gentle. Look at me. She turned to face him, and in the soft lamplight of her small apartment, she looked beautiful and vulnerable and completely essential to his happiness. I don't feel obligated, he said. I feel lucky. Lucky that you trusted me with your son. Lucky that you let me into your lives. And lucky that I get to fall asleep every night knowing that somewhere in this city, you and Miguel are safe and happy. You're falling asleep thinking about us, Maria asked with a small smile. Every night, James admitted, and waking up thinking about you too. They were sitting closer now, and James could smell her shampoo and see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. He wanted to kiss her, had been wanting to for weeks, but he also wanted to make sure she understood that his feelings weren't contingent on their arrangement. After tomorrow, he said, after Miguel's surgery and recovery, after all the legal stuff is settled, I want you to know that you'll have choices. You won't be trapped or obligated to anything. If you want to stay in my life, it'll be because you choose to, not because you have to. Maria studied his face, searching for any sign of insincerity. What she found instead was the same honesty and integrity that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "What if I choose to stay because I want to?" she asked softly. "What if I'm falling for you too? And not just because you're saving my son?" James felt his heart stop and restart. "Then, I'd say we're both very lucky people." This time, when he leaned toward her, Maria met him halfway. Their first kiss was soft and tentative, full of promise and hope, and the recognition that they were crossing a line from which there would be no return. When they finally broke apart, Maria rested her forehead against his, and they both marveled at how right it felt to be together. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Maria said, "I want you to know that these past few weeks have been the happiest of my life, despite everything. You gave me hope when I had none left. You gave me a family when I didn't even know I wanted one," James replied. They spent the rest of the evening talking quietly about their dreams for Miguel's future, about the life they might build together, and about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together in the first place. When they finally said good night, and James settled onto the couch with a pillow and blanket Maria had provided, he felt more at peace than he had in years. The surgery the next day was a success beyond anyone's wildest hopes. Dr. Rodriguez later told them that Miguel's new heart had started beating in his chest as if it had always belonged there, and the little boy's color improved so dramatically that the nurses kept stopping by just to smile at him. James had been pacing the surgical waiting room for 6 hours when Dr. Rodriguez finally emerged with the news. Maria had been too nervous to sit, alternating between pacing and staring out the window and clutching James's hand so tightly that he lost circulation in his fingers. When the doctor told him that Miguel was not only going to be fine, but was likely to have a completely normal childhood, Maria collapsed into James's arms and sobbed with relief and joy. The recovery was long, but steady. Miguel spent 3 weeks in the hospital, during which time James and Maria took turns sleeping in the chair beside his bed. James learned to braid Maria's hair when she was too tired to do it herself, and Maria learned that James sang off-key but enthusiastic lullabies when he thought no one was listening. They developed routines and inside jokes, and the kind of easy intimacy that usually took couples years to achieve. The legal battles continued, but they became background noise to the more important business of healing and building their new family. Catherine Hartwell made one final attempt to challenge the adoption by hiring a private investigator to dig up dirt on both James and Maria, but the investigation only revealed what everyone already knew. James was an honorable man with a successful business and no criminal record, and Maria was a devoted mother who had never done anything more scandalous than getting a parking ticket. Finally, on a cold December morning, James received the call from his attorney. The adoption was final. Miguel Santos was now legally Miguel Mitchell, and James was officially his father. When he shared the news with Maria and Miguel in their hospital room, the little boy's response was to throw his arms around James's neck and declare loudly enough for the entire ward to hear, "I got a new daddy, and I got to keep my mama." That evening, as they prepared to bring Miguel home to James's house for the first time, Maria pulled James aside for a private conversation. "I need you to know something," she said seriously. "When I made you that offer back in October, when I said I'd belong to you if you saved my son, I meant it as a desperate promise from a scared mother. But now, James prompted gently, "now I want to belong to you because I love you. Not because I have to, but because I choose to. Because you're the best man I've ever known. And because you love my son like he's your own blood." James cupped her face in his hands, marveling at how much his life had changed in just 2 months. And I want you to belong to me because I can't imagine my life without you and Miguel in it. Because you both make me a better person than I ever thought I could be. Their second kiss was different from their first. Where that one had been tentative and questioning, this one was confident and full of promises. It was the kiss of two people who had chosen each other freely and completely, and who were ready to build a life together based on love rather than desperation. As they walked out of the hospital together 3 days later, Miguel between them holding both their hands, James reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. 6 months ago, he'd been a successful but lonely man with an empty house and no real family. Now he was a husband and all, but named to a woman he adored, and a father to a little boy who called him Daddy, and meant it. The Hartwells had found another child to adopt, and James occasionally saw articles about them in the society pages, always showcasing their beautiful family in carefully staged photographs. He felt sorry for whatever child they'd eventually acquired, knowing he would never receive the genuine love and devotion that Miguel got from his new family every single day. As they drove home to start their new life together, Miguel fell asleep in his car seat, exhausted from the excitement of finally leaving the hospital. In the rearview mirror, James could see Maria watching their son with a soft expression of a mother who finally dared to believe her child was going to be okay. "Penny for your thoughts," James said softly. "I was thinking about how this all started," Maria replied. "How desperate I was that night when I asked you to save him. I would have done anything, promised you anything, just to keep him alive." "And now?" Maria smiled, the kind of radiant smile that made James's heart skip beats. "Now I get to keep all my promises because I want and not because I have to, and that makes all the difference in the world." As they pulled into the driveway of James's house, which was now truly their family home, James realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were born from the most desperate circumstances. He thought he was saving Maria and Miguel, but they'd saved him right back, showing him what it meant to have a real family and a love worth fighting for. The next chapter of their lives was about to begin, and James couldn't wait to see what it would bring. 6 months after Miguel's successful heart surgery, the Mitchell household had found its rhythm. James's large suburban home, once echoing with emptiness, now buzzed with the sounds of family life. Miguel's laughter echoing from the backyard as he played with the neighbor's dog, Maria humming while she cooked dinner in the spacious kitchen, and the evening routine of homework, bath time, and bedtime stories that had become the cornerstone of their days. Maria had indeed become everything she'd promised James that night in the hospital, but not in the way either of them had originally envisioned. She managed the household with the same fierce dedication she'd shown in caring for Miguel during his illness, but she'd also become so much more. She'd enrolled in night classes to finish her college degree, something she'd abandoned when Miguel was born. James had been the one to suggest it, pointing out that she was too intelligent and capable to limit herself to housework, no matter how much he appreciated everything she did. "I never thought I'd be going back to school at 26, Maria had said one evening as she struggled with a particularly challenging economics assignment at the kitchen table while James helped Miguel with his first grade reading homework. "You're not going back," James had replied, looking up from Miguel's book. "You're going forward. There's a difference." Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had expected. What had started as a desperate arrangement between strangers had grown into a partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and an increasingly deep emotional connection. They'd been living together for months now, but they'd taken things slowly, sleeping in separate bedrooms and focusing on building their family dynamic before fully exploring their romantic feelings. But the chemistry between them was undeniable. James found himself stealing glances at Maria as she moved through their home, marveling at her grace and competence. The way she laughed at Miguel's jokes, the fierce concentration on her face as she studied for exams, the gentle way she touched James's shoulder when she passed his chair at dinner. All of it made him fall a little more in love with her every day. For her part, Maria had discovered that loving James was the easiest thing in the world. He was patient with Miguel's endless questions, supportive of her educational goals, and thoughtful in 1,000 small ways that showed her she was valued and cherished. When she'd gotten food poisoning from a questionable lunch at school, James had taken a day off work to care for her, bringing her soup and medicine and keeping Miguel entertained so she could rest. When her car broke down and she couldn't afford to fix it, James had simply handed her the keys to his second vehicle, a comfortable SUV that was much more reliable than anything she'd ever owned. The first real test of their relationship came on a warm spring evening when Miguel was at a sleepover with his best friend Tommy from school. It was the first night they'd spent alone in the house since Miguel had come home from the hospital, and both James and Maria were acutely aware of the significance. They'd had dinner together, cleaned up the kitchen, and settled on the couch to watch a movie, but neither was really paying attention to the screen. Finally, James muted the television and turned to face Maria. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice serious enough to make Maria's heart skip. "Okay," she replied, preparing herself for whatever was coming. "I'm in love with you," James said simply. "Not because you're grateful to me, not because we're living together, not because of any arrangement we made. I'm in love with you because you're funny and smart and brave and beautiful, and because watching you love Miguel has shown me what real devotion looks like. I'm in love with you because you make me want to be the best version of myself every single day." Maria felt tears spring to her eyes. She'd been hoping to hear those words for months, but had been afraid to believe they could be true. "I'm in love with you too," she whispered, "so much that it sometimes scares me. I never thought I could feel this way about anyone, especially not under these circumstances. But, James, what we have, it's real, isn't it? It's not just gratitude or convenience or some weird trauma bond." James reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears that had started to fall. "Maria, what we have is the realest thing I've ever experienced. You and Miguel, this life we're building together. It's everything I never knew I wanted." When they kissed this time, it was different from their previous gentle, tentative kisses. This one was full of months of suppressed passion and emotion, the kiss of two people who had found their way to each other through the darkness and were ready to claim their happiness. That night, for the first time, Maria didn't go to her separate bedroom. She stayed with James, and they made love with a tenderness and intensity that confirmed what they'd both known for months. They weren't just partners in raising Miguel. They were soulmates who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances. The next morning, when Miguel came home from his sleepover full of stories about the movies he'd watched and the games he'd played, he took one look at James and Maria sitting together at the breakfast table and grinned. "Are you guys finally married now?" he asked with the directness that only children possess. James and Maria looked at each other and started laughing. "Not yet, buddy," James said, "but maybe we should talk about that." The proposal, when it came 3 months later, was perfect in its simplicity. James had been planning something elaborate, but the moment chose itself. Miguel had just scored his first goal in his youth soccer league, and as the three of them walked off the field together, Miguel skipping between them and chattering excitedly about the game, James suddenly stopped walking. "Maria," he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. "I had this whole speech planned, but looking at you right now, with our son, after watching you cheer for him like he just won the World Cup, I realize that this is our life. This is our family. And I want to make it official." He dropped to one knee right there on the soccer field, with other families packing up their folding chairs around them, and Miguel staring in wide-eyed delight. "Maria Santos, will you marry me? Will you be my wife officially, not just in my heart? Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you and Miguel and whatever other children we might have together?" Maria didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." As James slipped the ring on her finger and Miguel whooped with joy, Maria felt like her heart might burst from happiness. A year ago, she'd been a desperate single mother watching her child die and facing the impossible choice of giving him away to save his life. Now she was engaged to the love of her life, mother to a healthy, happy child, and looking forward to a future that was brighter than anything she'd ever dared to dream. The wedding planning process revealed new depths to their relationship. James wanted Maria to have whatever kind of wedding she desired, but Maria, ever practical, wanted something small and meaningful rather than expensive and showy. They compromised on a ceremony in James's backyard, beautifully decorated with flowers from Maria's new garden and attended by the people who had become their chosen family. Dr. Rodriguez and several of the nurses from the hospital who had become like extended family. Maria's evening school study group, who had supported her through her degree, James's business partner and closest friend, and a handful of neighbors who had welcomed Maria and Miguel with open arms. Miguel served as ring bearer and took his duties very seriously, practicing his walk down the makeshift aisle for weeks beforehand. On the day of the wedding, he wore a tiny tuxedo that matched James's suit and carried the rings on a satin pillow with the utmost solemnity until James winked at him during the vows, causing Miguel to break into a huge grin that made the whole gathering laugh. Maria's wedding dress was simple but elegant, chosen because Miguel had said it made her look like a princess, but not too fancy. She carried a bouquet of roses from her garden and wore a necklace that had been her grandmother's, her something old. Her something new was the life she was stepping into. Something borrowed was the confidence James had helped her find in herself. And something blue was the healthy color of Miguel's lips as he watched his parents get married. During their vows, Maria spoke about how James had taught her that love wasn't always about sacrifice and loss, that sometimes it was about finding someone who made you feel like the best version of yourself. James talked about how Maria had shown him the difference between being alone and being lonely, and how she and Miguel had filled spaces in his life he hadn't even known were empty. But the most touching moment came when they exchanged family vows, a tradition they'd created specifically for their unique situation. James knelt down to Miguel's level and promised to always love and protect him, to be patient when he was learning new things, and to never try to replace his mama's love, but to add to it. Miguel, in response, promised to always be a good boy, to help take care of mama, and to love James as much as ice cream, which everyone agreed was quite a lot. The reception was held in their backyard, with tables set up under string lights and a simple buffet of Maria's favorite foods. James's business partner gave a toast about how he'd never seen his friend happier than he'd been since Maria and Miguel came into his life. Dr. Rodriguez spoke about the healing power of love and how Miguel's recovery had been accelerated by the stability and joy of his new family. But the most memorable speech came from Miguel himself, who stood on his chair and announced to the assembled guests that he was the luckiest boy in the whole world because I got a new heart and my mama got a new husband and we all got to live happily ever after like in the books. Their honeymoon was a week at the beach, the first real vacation any of them had ever taken. Miguel built elaborate sandcastles while James and Maria walked along the shore, marveling at how far they'd all come. On their last evening there, as they watched Miguel chase hermit crabs and collect seashells, Maria turned to James with a soft smile. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if Miguel hadn't gotten sick?" she asked. James considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I remember that if he hadn't gotten sick, I would never have met you. I'd still be living in that empty house, thinking my work was enough to make me happy. Miguel's illness was terrible, but it led us to each other. I can't regret that. I used to think that loving someone meant being willing to sacrifice everything for them," Maria said. "With Miguel, I was ready to give up my own happiness to save his life. But with you, I learned that the best kind of love is when you don't have to sacrifice anything because you're both working toward the same goals." As they walked back to their hotel room that evening, Miguel between them holding both their hands and chattering about all the shells he'd found, James reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had started as a desperate woman's last-ditch attempt to save her son had evolved into a love story that neither of them could have imagined. Back home after the honeymoon, they settled into married life with the ease of people who had already been partners in every way that mattered. Maria finished her degree in business administration with honors, and James supported her as she started her own consulting firm helping small businesses with their financial planning. Miguel thrived in school and sports, his energy and enthusiasm a constant reminder of the miracle of his recovery. But perhaps the greatest joy came 8 months after their wedding, when Maria told James that they were going to have a baby. They'd been trying for a few months, and when the pregnancy test showed positive, Maria felt a completeness she hadn't known she'd been missing. Miguel was thrilled at the prospect of being a big brother and immediately began planning all the things he would teach the baby. "I'll show him how to build block castles and how to feed the birds in the backyard and how to make Mama laugh when she's tired from school," he announced importantly. James was overwhelmed with emotion at the thought of having a child with Maria, a baby that would be born into the loving, stable family they'd created together. When they went for their first ultrasound and heard the baby's strong, healthy heartbeat, both James and Maria cried with joy and gratitude. As Maria's pregnancy progressed, their family dynamic continued to evolve and deepen. James was attentive and protective without being overbearing, and Miguel appointed himself Maria's special helper, bringing her crackers when she had morning sickness and patting her growing belly while talking to his unborn sibling. On a quiet Sunday evening in late fall, as they sat together in their living room, Maria knitting baby clothes, James reading while Miguel worked on a puzzle at their feet, Maria looked around at the life they'd built and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. A little over 2 years ago, she'd been a desperate mother making an impossible offer to a stranger in a hospital corridor. Now she was surrounded by love, security, and the promise of even more joy to come. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "Just all of this." Maria gestured around their warm, comfortable home. 2 years ago, if someone had told me this is where I'd be, I never would have believed them. "Do you regret any of it?" James asked. "Even the hard parts?" Maria shook her head without hesitation. "Not a single moment. Even the scary parts, even the desperate parts, they were all necessary to get us here. And here is exactly where we're supposed to be. As if sensing the emotional weight of the conversation, Miguel looked up from his puzzle and climbed onto the couch between his parents, snuggling against Maria's side while James wrapped them both in his arms. In that moment, with their family complete and a new baby on the way, they all felt the profound contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The little boy who had once fought for his life in a hospital bed was now healthy and happy, surrounded by love and security. The desperate mother who had been willing to sacrifice everything for her child had found that sometimes the universe gives you more than you dare to ask for. And the successful but lonely man who had thought his life was complete had discovered that his real life was just beginning. Their story had started with a promise born of desperation, but it had become something beautiful, a testament to the power of love, the importance of family, and the miraculous ways that lives can intersect and transform each other in the most unexpected moments. 5 years had passed since that desperate night in the hospital corridor, and the Mitchell family had grown in ways none of them could have imagined. Their daughter, Sophia Isabella Mitchell, was now 3 years old, a spirited little girl with Maria's dark curls and James's green eyes, who followed her big brother Miguel everywhere and called him Miggy in a voice that could melt the hardest heart. Miguel, now 10 years old, had not only survived his heart transplant, but thrived beyond anyone's wildest expectations. He played soccer with the enthusiasm of any healthy child, excelled in school, and had developed into a protective, loving big brother who took his responsibilities very seriously. The scar down his chest had faded to a thin silver line that he wore like a badge of honor, often telling his friends about his special heart with the matter-of-fact pride that only children possess. Maria had successfully built her consulting business into a thriving enterprise, helping dozens of small business owners navigate their financial challenges. Her success had given her a confidence and independence that complemented rather than competed with her role as wife and mother. She often worked from their home office, allowing her to be present for school pickups and soccer games while still pursuing her professional goals. James had expanded his security firm and now specialized in providing safety consulting for medical facilities, inspired by his experiences during Miguel's treatment. He'd become something of an expert in hospital security protocols and had consulted on the design of 3 new children's hospitals, always with an eye toward creating environments that felt safe and welcoming for families in crisis. But it was on a Thursday morning in March that their past and present collided in a way that would test everything they'd built together. James was in his office reviewing security plans for a new pediatric wing when his assistant knocked on his door with an unusual expression on her face. "Mr. Mitchell," she said carefully, "there's a woman here to see you. She says it's about Miguel and that it's urgent. Her name is Catherine Hartwell." James felt his blood turn to ice. He hadn't heard from or thought about the Hartwells in years, and Catherine's sudden appearance could only mean trouble. His first instinct was to refuse to see her, but his professional training kicked in. It was better to know what threat you were facing than to ignore it and hope it went away. "Send her in," he said, already reaching for his phone to text Maria a warning. Catherine Hartwell entered his office looking much older than her years. Her once perfect blonde hair was streaked with gray, and her face bore the lines of someone who had experienced significant stress and disappointment. She was still expensively dressed, but there was a desperate quality to her appearance that reminded James uncomfortably of how Maria had looked on that first night in the hospital. "Mr. Mitchell," Catherine said, settling into the chair across from his desk without being invited. "Thank you for seeing me. I know this is unexpected." Mrs. Hartwell, James replied coolly. I have to say I'm curious about what could possibly bring you to my office after all these years. Catherine's composure cracked slightly, and James saw something he'd never expected to see from her: vulnerability. It's about my daughter, she said quietly. Emma. She's 7 years old, and she's dying. Despite his personal feelings about Catherine Hartwell, James felt his protective instincts engage. A child was in danger, and that always took precedence over past grievances. I'm sorry to hear that, he said, his tone softening slightly. What's wrong with her? The same condition Miguel had, Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. She needs a heart transplant, but the waiting list is so long, and her condition is deteriorating rapidly. The doctors say she has weeks, maybe a month if we're lucky. James began to understand why Catherine was here. What does this have to do with me, Mrs. Hartwell? Catherine looked directly at him for the first time since entering his office. Miguel's donor heart came from a motorcycle accident victim whose family specifically requested that if any of their loved one's organs ever needed to be passed on, they wanted Miguel's family to have the right of first refusal. The statement hit James like a physical blow. He'd known that organ recipients sometimes needed additional transplants, but it had never occurred to him that this situation might arise with Miguel. Are you saying that Miguel needs another transplant? James asked, his heart racing with panic. No, Catherine said quickly. Miguel's heart is fine. Better than fine, according to Dr. Rodriguez, whom I spoke with yesterday. But Emma needs a heart, and there's something called a domino transplant procedure. Miguel's heart, which has grown strong and healthy, could be transplanted to Emma, and Miguel could receive a new heart from a more compatible donor who's already been identified. James sat back in his chair, feeling like the world had tilted off its axis. The idea of Miguel undergoing another heart surgery, of putting him at risk again after all they'd been through, was almost unbearable. Why are you coming to me with this? James asked. Shouldn't you be talking to Miguel's medical team? I tried, Catherine admitted. But Dr. Rodriguez said that any decision about Miguel's medical care would have to be made by his legal guardians. That's you, Anne Maria, and I know I have no right to ask this of you. I know how we treated you and Maria during the adoption process. I know we were horrible people who saw Miguel as a commodity rather than child. Her voice broke on the last words, and James saw tears streaming down her face. But Emma is dying, Catherine continued, and I understand now what Maria felt when she was facing the possibility of losing Miguel. I understand the desperation, the willingness to do anything, sacrifice anything, to save your child. I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago, Mr. Mitchell. Losing Miguel to you taught me some hard lessons about what really matters. James studied Catherine's face, looking for any sign of manipulation or insincerity. What he saw instead was genuine anguish and the same desperate love for a child that had driven Maria to make her impossible offer all those years ago. Mrs. Hartwell, James said carefully, even if I were inclined to consider this, which I'm not saying I am, the decision wouldn't be mine alone. Maria and Miguel would both have to be part of any discussion about his medical care. I understand, Catherine said. I'm not asking for an answer today. I'm just asking you to think about it, to talk to your family. Emma doesn't have long, and this might be her only chance. After Catherine left, James sat alone in his office for nearly an hour, trying to process what he'd just heard. The thought of putting Miguel through another surgery was terrifying, but the thought of letting a child die when they might be able to help was equally unbearable. Finally, he picked up his phone and called Maria. Hey, she answered on the first ring. I got your text. Is everything okay? Can you come to the office? James asked, We need to talk, and it's not a conversation for the phone. An hour later, Maria sat in the same chair Catherine had occupied, her face growing pale as James explained the situation. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the city skyline. "What do you think we should do?" James asked finally. "I think," Maria said slowly, "we need to talk to Miguel. He's 10 years old, and he's smart enough to understand what's being asked of him. This is his body, his heart, his risk. He deserves to have a voice in this decision." That evening, after Sophia had been put to bed, James and Maria sat Miguel down in their living room and explained the situation as gently and clearly as they could. Miguel listened with the serious attention he gave to all important matters, asking occasional questions for clarification. "So let me make sure I understand," Miguel said when they'd finished. "There's a little girl who needs a heart like I did, and my heart could save her life, but I'd have to have surgery again to get a new heart." "That's right," Maria said. "But, Miguel, you need to know that this surgery would be voluntary. You don't have to do it. Your heart is healthy and strong, and you could live a completely normal life without ever having another surgery." Miguel was quiet for several minutes, his face scrunched up in the expression he wore when working through complex math problems. "Can I meet her?" he asked finally. "The little girl?" James and Maria exchanged glances. "You want to meet Emma?" "If I'm going to give her my heart, I want to know who she is," Miguel said matter-of-factly. "I want to know what she likes to do and what makes her happy. My heart has been taking care of me for 5 years, and if it's going to take care of someone else, I want to make sure she's worth it." The meeting was arranged for the following Saturday at the hospital. Catherine brought Emma, a tiny girl with enormous brown eyes and Catherine's blonde hair, but none of her mother's former coldness. Emma was shy but curious, and she and Miguel spent an hour coloring together while the adults watched nervously from across the room. "Does it hurt?" Emma asked Miguel quietly, pointing to the scar on his chest that was visible through his open shirt collar. "Not anymore," Miguel said. "It hurt a lot at first, but now it just looks cool." "Want to see?" Emma nodded, and Miguel carefully showed her his scar, explaining how the doctors had given him a new heart and how much better he felt afterward. "Were you scared?" Emma asked. "Really scared," Miguel admitted. "But my mama and daddy were there the whole time, and all the doctors and nurses were super nice. And you know what? After I got better, I could run and play soccer and do everything I wanted to do." Emma's eyes lit up. "I want to play soccer too, and I want to ride a bike and go swimming." "If you get a new heart, you'll be able to do all of that," Miguel told her seriously. "Hearts are really important. They help you do all the fun stuff." After Emma and Catherine left, Miguel was unusually quiet during dinner. Finally, as Maria was clearing the dishes, he spoke up. "I want to do it," he said. "I want to give Emma my heart." "Miguel," James said gently, "this is a really big decision. You don't have to decide right now." "I already decided," Miguel said with the kind of certainty that only children possess. "Emma is really sick, and I used to be really sick, and someone gave me their heart so I could get better. Now I can give my heart to Emma, so she can get better too. It's like passing it forward." Maria felt tears sting her eyes. Her son, who had received so much love and generosity from others, was ready to pass that gift along to someone who needed it. "Are you sure?" Maria asked. "Really, really sure?" Miguel nodded solemnly. "I'm sure. Plus, I'll get a new heart that's even better for me now that I'm bigger." Dr. Rodriguez explained it.